Hello everybody, so I was planning on doing a different video today, but I had to scrap that last minute, so I'm doing this video instead, which should be much quicker and easier and less complicated, as the video should indeed say. Now, the reason I'm making this video is not really to get on a moral soapbox. I don't think I'm going to do that at any point during this video. I'm actually talking specifically about whenever anybody asks about the Israel-Palestine conflict, everybody says, oh, it's a very complicated topic. It's really complicated. And I'm going to argue that it's not that complicated in terms of the actual conflict itself. What I'm objecting to is the idea that this is a uniquely difficult conflict to explain, because really it's not. It's kind of simple. Basically, you have two sides, or two different peoples, who both have a claim to this particular region, which I'm going to call Palestine because I think that is the more neutral term to refer to it, because that's what the Romans called it. I just think it's a better, and it's of course what the British called it when they first, established it as mandatory Palestine. So I'm going to use the term Palestine to refer to the region in general. And with that said, the Jews, of course, lived in Palestine for a long time. I'm not going to get into the exact chronology of it, but they lived there for a long time until, of course, in 70 AD, they were kicked out by the Romans. There was a big revolt, and Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews basically spread throughout much of the world, but Europe's the only part that matters for the sake of this discussion. So, the Jews were in Europe, but they still had a sense of themselves as a distinct group of people, that they were Jews from their homeland, Palestine, which of course I guess they would have called Judah. And this continues until you get into the 19th century, where you start to see nationalism emerge. And of course nationalism is the idea that, different sort of ethnicities constitute different groups of people, that there are French people who are distinctly French, there are English people who are distinctly English, and this is in contrast to how it used to work, which was basically feudalism, where what grouped people together in a political entity was their mutual subjection to, a lord, and then of course eventually going up to a king. Now, not so coincidentally, of course, in the 1870, I think it was literally bang on 1870, both Italy and Germany were united based on the idea that there should be a singular nation state for the Germanic or not Germanic actually, Germanic's a bit too broad, the German and Italian people. And kind of unsurprisingly, the Jews, who had maintained this idea that they were a unique, distinct group of people, saw all of this happening and said, oh, hold on a minute, we should have a land for ourselves as well. All of these other different groups of people have nation states. The French have France, Germans have Germany, Italians have Italy. I mean, they just invented, they unified those countries. They created those countries, relatively recently. So we should create a country for the Jews. And, I think there were several candidates for it. Should be, but of course the relevant idea, and the one which in some sense makes the most sense from a historical perspective, is they thought, let's go back to Judea. I think I said Judah and I meant to say Judea. We'll go back to Judea, which, like I say, neutrally generally referred to as Palestine. And that's where we should establish our nation state. And of course there were some Jewish people who had risen up the ranks in society to varying degrees, and particularly in the UK, I think they were doing pretty well for themselves, and they influenced, and I don't want that to sound nefarious, I'm just saying they, maneuvered some kind of political favour from the British political establishment, and the British political establishment basically said, okay, you know what, we will work to create this nation state for the Jews, and we will establish it in Palestine. I actually went to a house recently that was owned by the Rothschilds, and it had in it the letter that was given to Lord Rothschild, I don't know which Rothschild it would have been, basically saying, I think it was, the Balfour Declaration, basically saying, we will establish the nation state of Israel in Palestine. So there you go. That's what happened. And then obviously after that, you just have the small matter of people moving there all of, basically establishing a nation state, which I don't think is a small task. But essentially, by the time you get to the Balfour Declaration, you've got to a point where the intentions have been made by, at that point, the preeminent global superpower. So that's it. I think that's as far as you need to go. But of course, in the meantime, between 70 AD and 1917 AD, this incredibly important region, Palestine, the Levant more broadly, of course, being the crossroads of the world to a very real extent, it didn't just remain empty, obviously. Instead, people moved there. And, the fact that people moved there meant that they then started to form their own identity. And these were, I think, broadly Arabs. I don't know if it's right to say pretty much exclusively Arabs, but Arabs who migrated into the region, and they lived in Palestine. And even though, of course, there was never a Palestinian nation state, which you wouldn't really expect there to be because the idea of a nation state wasn't really a thing, it's certainly true that these people, they weren't Syrians, they weren't Egyptians, they were living in Palestine, they were Palestinians. And basically, therefore, they're like, hey, we already live here. The reality is that the Palestinian side of the story is much simpler. It's just they move there, they live there for over 1,000 years, and in that time, they became, basically, a nationality, an ethnicity, as indeed any group of people who move to an area and stay there for 1,000 years would do. So you have the Palestinians already living there, and thus you end up with a situation where you have the Jews, who, I already went through their story, they have their reason for wanting to be in Palestine, and the Palestinians, who obviously not quite as much of a story, but definitely a pretty strong case for, hey, we should be able to live here too. And that is basically the grounds for the conflict. Now, you might say that actually does sound pretty complicated, but the thing is it really any more complicated than most other wars? Because there are two conflicts that come to mind, especially, from the perspective of a British person. An obvious one would be the Troubles in Ireland. And what's the story of the Troubles in Ireland? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically you had Irish people living in Ireland who were very attached to their identity as Irish people. And one thing there that was particularly relevant was their enthusiasm for the Catholic Church. But meanwhile, of course, Ireland got defeated many times in various different wars by, broadly speaking, the English, you might say. However, the most of the people who settled were Scottish, particularly Scottish Presbyterians. So in Northern Ireland, which of course is very close to Scotland, the Scottish came in. Of course, there were some English too and some Welsh, I would assume, and they basically formed a new identity, a Northern Irish identity. And, of course, plenty of people who were originally from Ireland would also have intermixed there and, associated with the Scottish. And, of course, the religious aspect was, again, relevant. These people were Presbyterians, Reformed Christians, and therefore you ended up with these two distinct identities. You ended up with the Scottish, or the kind of, I believe, Ulster Scots is the common term for them, who eventually just came to be considered Northern Irish, and of course, became increasingly removed from Scotland, and, basically nowadays they sound much more distinctly Irish, for example. So you had these people who became Northern Irish, and then you had these people who were Irish in the traditional sense. They were Irish and they didn't have any of this Scottish Presbyterian stuff going on, and that's all well and good. But then eventually, Ireland says, we're going to break away from the UK. And they do. But then you have Northern Ireland, which both sides have a case there. You could say, well, the Northern Irish, of kind of Scottish descent, have lived there for a long time. They're established there. They've formed a genuine national identity. You can't just say they all need to go back to Scotland. They none of them were born in Scotland. None of their grandparents or even great-grandparents were probably born in Scotland. They've been there for hundreds of years. You can't just say they need to get kicked out. But the Irish were like, well, that's our land. It's our rightful land. You took it from us with imperialism and by invading us, but it's our land, so we should have it. And therein lies the whole conflict of Northern Ireland. You had, of course, the Irish nationalists who were saying it should be our land and doing all this terrorism and stuff. And then you had the Northern Irish who were saying, no, this is our land. We live here. And they were, of course, doing terrorism. Now, this should sound pretty familiar. It's two groups of people who both have a claim to this piece of land and were fighting over it quite intensely. And of course, there are other examples. The only other example I'll mention is the Balkans, where basically you had a situation where it was controlled by the Ottomans for a very long period of time. And because there was one established empire that ruled over everything, there wasn't really any sense of like national borders. You could just move around within the empire. So you basically ended up with a situation where there was lots of kind of intermingling of the different groups, the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnians, blah, 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 which is all fine until, of course, the Ottomans fall away and you end up with a situation where somebody has to decide, where are we going to draw these arbitrary lines to establish the nation state for the Serbians? You know, essentially what happened is lots of these Eastern countries began to say, hey, you know, we want to get on board with this nation state thing, you know, like the French and the Spanish and the Italians and the Germans and the English. So we're going to, although it's kind of weird to say English because of course there isn't really an English nation state, there's a British nation state. But anyway, they were like, we want to get on board with this. But the problem is that they had, you know, wherever you tried to draw the border, you're either cutting out a lot of, let's say, Serbians. You're either cutting out a lot of Serbians or you're including a lot of non-Serbians. So what's the solution? Well, of course, for a while, it kind of ended up sort of conveniently that Yugoslavia existed and basically kept all of those people pretty much together. I think there were a lot of conflicts after World War I, where essentially the Czechoslovakia and Hungary, after Hungary broke up, there was plenty of like violence and stuff, which was, I think, mitigated to some extent by the, you know, intervention of you know, various countries were like, hey, let's not have too much murdering each other. Anyway, but the point is that after Yugoslavia collapsed, then people start saying, no, we need a Serbian country, a Bosnian country, a Croatian country. And what happened? Well, they all started killing each other because they were like, you know, it's like, well, who's to say if you draw an arbitrary line, you know, and you say this is Serbia and this is Bosnia, then a lot of the Bosnians on this side will say, actually, no, we think, you know, we've lived here for ages, we should be allowed here. Whereas the Serbians will say, no, this is part of Serbia. You need to get out, fight. And the same thing over here. Of course, you know, sometimes it would even be the Serbians on this side saying, you need to get out. Basically, that's the issue. But again, it's basically just the same thing. You end up with a situation where, because the story of where different peoples have been throughout history doesn't neatly line up with the idea that every single group should get their own clearly defined, delineated nation state, you end up with conflict. It's kind of one of the big issues with having a nation state in general. But obviously those are just two examples. I would say, generally speaking, it seems like certainly most modern wars that you can point to, it's always been a case of two different groups of people, each saying that they should have this thing, and both sort of having a legitimate case for that thing. You don't usually get wars nowadays that are purely acts of aggression. There's always, nearly always, going to be a sense of like, well, actually, this piece of land should really belong to us. And the other person saying, no, this piece of land should belong to us. And because most of the time there's actually some legitimacy to these claims, inevitably it's going to be complicated because you've got to get into, well, why do both sides feel like they should have a right to this piece of land? I mean, you could look at Crimea, for example, recently. The Russians have an argument, the Ukrainians have an argument. If you want to understand a conflict, you have to understand both sides' arguments. It's basically the same thing with Israel-Palestine, but it's the same with every war. You know, it's the same with Ireland. It's the same with Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia. Yeah, this idea that the Israel conflict is uniquely complicated, I just don't really get it, because I would say, actually, when you talk about the basis of the conflict, it's basically just the same as every other war. It's two different sides, both feel like they should have a right to this piece of land, both feel like it should be their land and their people's land, having a little fight over it. Anyway, so actually let's talk about morality. I did just say it was going to be explaining the situation, but no, let's talk a bit about this. So I think the first point is, do both sides have legitimate claims? I kind of already hinted at this, but I think, if you're talking about morality, it's something worth considering. And my answer is yes, definitely. I really do think that both sides in the Israel-Palestine conflict, I completely get where they're coming from. I think they're both just completely reasonable claims. I think the same thing about the Ireland conflict too. I don't know about the Balkans. I think they should just stayed Yugoslavia. Sorry, the specific part of the Balkans that was Yugoslavia. They should have just stayed Yugoslavia. I don't know why they needed to have a fight about that. But, Israel-Palestine, I get why there's a conflict, and I think they both have quite a legitimate grievance. Now, I think a very valid and relevant question is, of course, well, isn't nationalism inherently bad? I mean, certainly nowadays, if we talk about, say, the British National Party, we would say, and we would say they're nationalists. Like, if you hear about a party nowadays and it says, oh, we are the Nationalist Party, then you would, I think, be quite right in saying, well, that sounds a bit dodgy. It sounds kind of like they might be racist. And certainly that's true. Like, as a British person, I don't have any enthusiasm for the idea of British nationalism, but I think it's important to recognise the distinction between nationalism as a political force in a modern Western country versus nationalism, first of all, in the historical sense. When we talk about the nationalism in France, it's not really accurate to compare that to like the British National Party. Nationalism in France was basically a movement to justify why there should even exist such a country as France once you don't have the authority of a king or something to say that you're all my subjects. That's basically what nationalism was. And obviously there's a strong argument to be made that in some senses nationalism was, first of all, quite a liberal force in that sense. It was trying to ground the idea that there should exist such a thing as a country, that there should exist such a thing as like a society with some kind of centralized authority in something real and material, the shared heritage and kind of ethnicity of the people within that country. In a very real sense, when you talk about Italy, say, when it was just a series of arbitrary, divided up little kingdoms, that wasn't necessarily the most kind of liberal state of existence, because it was basically just arbitrary, random countries with all of their kind of authority and people running a motorbike really loud outside the room. I don't know if it's going to be picked up. So within that sense, and I think nationalism was a big part of that, when you basically say we're not going to justify the existence of these countries around the authority of, the powers that be, we're going to justify the existence of these countries based on the, like I say, shared ethnic heritage of the people within those countries. So within that sense, you've got nationalism in a historic sense, which is, you could say a positive. And then, of course, you have nationalism as it can exist today as a force for liberation. Certainly, there are lots of people who have been victims of imperialism who would be nationalist because they want to oppose that imperialism. So in that sense, you have nationalism as a positive thing. So I think it's very easy to just say that nationalism is bad. To just say, well, and of course it can go both ways. You could say, well, why should the Palestinians feel like they should need a nation state for their nation? Or indeed you could say, well, why should the Jews feel that they should need a nation state for their nation? It's easy to criticize nationalism, but the problem is most people are saying this from the perspective of people who already have their own countries. And, I don't know to what extent I'm willing to believe that those people would be completely content still existing as, say, English people, but not having any political entity, any geographic region that was for English people, that they're just forced to basically be a national identity completely robbed of any sort of nation state, any sort of country in which they could live. So no, I think it's just a bit lazy to just say, oh, nationalism's bad, everyone should just, hang around and sing Kumbaya. I do think that's a nice goal, and certainly that's why I'm, a fan of, in principle, things like the European Union, which try to reduce the relevance of nations, and I think that's one very effective way to reduce the likelihood of, major conflicts. Like, the less relevant nations and national division becomes, the less it matters. and the less likely people are to fight over which nation should have which particular thing. And I think that's a cool thing about regionalism and, eventually kind of globalism, that it does mean that you don't have to have these massive fights over who should have which piece of land. But I do think that saying all of this, the nations are kind of the building blocks of regionalism. And of course, regions are in turn kind of the building blocks of globalism. So to just say, well, we just shouldn't have nationalism, we should all just be globalists and just, like I say, sing Kumbaya in a big circle, it just seems kind of idealistic. This kind of leads on to the, big question, which is, should the UK have established, the nation of Israel, which I think is an interesting question. I mean, obviously it's very related, but the interesting thing about it is, of course, that we're not talking about the morality of the current situation because it's too late now. But I do think it's an interesting thing to talk about, was the establishment of it initially an evil thing? And again, I would kind of say that when you talk about the nation of Israel as something which does come from imperialism, yeah, sure, you could actually make a legitimate criticism there. You could say, well, this was clearly something which, is part of the wider phenomenon of the UK going into places, and of course European powers in general going into places and saying, no, we're going to tell you how to organise everything. We're going to draw these lines and explain where everyone needs to be. Which, of course, yeah, it is a bad thing. Now, obviously, at the point you run into the question of, well, why was it bad? And if you say, well, it was bad because it was nationalism, well, then you run into the issue I already pointed out, which is that, well, nationalism actually does have kind of a place in the organisation of global society. But obviously, if you just say, well, it was kind of imperialist and they really should have thought about it better. Well, that's maybe a point. Although it's worth stressing that in the letter, which I kind of already mentioned, it actually explicitly says, we don't want you to, go against the rights of the people who already live in this country. And to be fair, when you think about it, this was at a time in 1917 where there were many multi-ethnic societies. So I actually think that it wouldn't have been immediately obvious to the UK that establishing Palestine as a nation for the Jews, and basically establishing Israel as a nation for the Jews in Palestine, would have necessarily had led to bad things. Because at the time, like I say, there were plenty of diverse... I mean, the British Empire was, pretty damn diverse. So the idea that they'd be like, oh, if you establish Israel here, it's automatically going to lead to issues and conflicts with the Arabs already living there, maybe wouldn't have been obvious to the British. So there we go. That was my little defense of the British imperialists. Aren't I lovely? Now, another question, of course, aside from whether or not the UK should have established it, is the big kind of 100-year history of how the nation of Israel basically spread. And was that immoral? So, of course, Israel, at some point the idea was that it would be just small parts of Palestine would be occupied or inhabited by Jews, while other parts would, of course, be inhabited by Arabs. And eventually it's kind of like more and more of it has become Jewish. More and more of it has basically become Israel. And obviously now you've got to a situation where there are parts which aren't considered like they should be Israel. They're considered occupied areas, but those areas are also being inhabited by Jews. And there's a lot of them, lots of people object to that. Now, it is always worth noting that the Jews were quite consistently fighting defensive wars, although not always. But a lot of the time they were fighting defensive wars. And within that context, you could say, well, you lose a war, of course you lose land as a result of that, and of course that's how Israel's likely to spread. Now, of course, the alternative there, you say, well, but the fact Israel was there in the first place was already kind of, they were there occupying the Palestinians' land, so of course the Palestinians were going to fight back against it. I don't really know about that. I think, to be honest, plenty of blame lies on the Palestinians and the Arab countries in general for immediately going for, the military tactic, because of course it means that once the Israelis had won, can you really blame them for being like, what, we're not just going to give you back all of this land? It's not really surprising that they have spread in that way, and that they now occupy these areas, and they're like, what, we like occupying these areas that we gained in wars that were fought against us. So ultimately, when people kind of criticize like the idea of Israel spreading, basically in terms of the number of Jewish communities in that area, it's kind of like, it always seems a bit weird when you consider the fact that so many of the wars were defensive. And it's like, I don't know, can you really be that mad about the spreading within that context? I'm not entirely sure that it's accurate to portray Israel as like an expansionist power, really. A lot of it was defensive, so I've always just thought that criticism was a bit weird. But anyway, let's get to the modern day, because all of this is actually talking about stuff that happened in the past. So I think there are two questions which are really interesting. The first one is one side like more horrendously violent than the other? You know, if you wanted to make a moral judgment, you might say, well, this side's doing some really evil stuff. And it's kind of hard to say. I think, I'm a big fan of, talking about like white phosphorus and, like Israelis using chemical attacks and things like that. Just because I do think that the idea that like Israel, like there is an idea that exists, which is that Israel has just not put a foot wrong. I think that's a quite common idea in much of the West. The idea that Israel has basically, I think it's thundering. The idea that Israel has basically just been, or maybe it's one of the Iron Dome rockets or something, I don't know, already trying to hit me. I hope Iron Dome is the right term. Anyway, you always doubt yourself when you're making these videos and you say things off the cuff and you think, is that even a term? Basically, there's an idea in the UK that Israel just hasn't put a foot wrong, that they're just doing everything completely reasonably. They're basically being the most noble, like always conscious to minimize unnecessary casualties, basically fighting the best they possibly could. And I don't really think that's fair. Like, I think definitely Israel has done things they shouldn't have done. That Israel has not just been the most perfect, moral belligerents. But I also think it's probably true to say that they haven't been really terrible either. They're kind of basically, their actions seem to have been broadly in keeping with how I would expect most nations to fight. I don't think they've been particularly brutal, particularly violent, particularly thorough in their destruction of the Palestinian people in a military context. But at the same time, I also don't think you could say, well, they just have, completely, everything has been a completely measured response. You can't criticize anything. No, I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. Now, as for Palestine, obviously the criticism there, the most obvious one would be the whole terrorism thing. It's coming down. I think I might just keep recording. We're deep enough into this video at this point that if you can't withstand the fact that there's going to be some heavy rain noises, then I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, it is pretty bad. Blimey. It would be really funny if this isn't even being picked up, but I'm sure it must be. So, Palestine, terrorism, it's bad. The deaths of people, not good. But obviously, you do have that aspect. They are, in a, I think, much more real sense, targeting civilians and targeting innocents in a way that you couldn't say Israel is. Like, there are Palestinians who will literally be like, let's just target innocent people who are basically non-combatants, in order to affect the change that we want by basically just causing so much. I'm just in awe of how terrible the weather is right now. Cause so much death and destruction and misery for these people that they'll have to back down. Now, I don't think you can say that Israel has done something similar to that. I don't think you could say that Israel's like, we're just going to target civilians anyway, because then by targeting so many civilians, they'll have to back down. Whereas that does seem to be a genuine strategy that exists in certain Palestinian militant groups. It's like, hey, if we stab this random Jewish person, then the terror, the fear of, random indiscriminate violence will affect some kind of change in terms of what Israel's doing. Obviously, I don't think that's particularly kosher. But of course, there is the fact that you would automatically expect the Palestinian warfare to be asymmetrical. like Palestinians don't really have the ability to make sure they're only targeting the best things they could target. For example, I mean, I think you could say that, Western powers, by and large, have such an advantage in terms of many conflicts they're likely to be fighting that they can actually try to be more moral, and therefore the expectation is that they will be more moral. They can make sure that they target only the exact people who need to be targeted. They can be very discriminate in the battles that they fight in such a way that they don't lead to huge amounts of unnecessary violence. Whereas, of course, if you are the person who has less power, if you're not in a position to really fight a conventional war at all, never mind a conventional war at a considerable advantage, you're probably just going to have to take what you can get. And that might just mean killing people, just left, right, and center, not really trying to minimize casualties or anything like that. So to be honest, I feel like maybe this was more rambling than it needed to be, to basically say neither side's perfect, both sides are pretty bad. There's no side, like I've never ever thought to myself, yes, the Palestinians are the good guys, or the Israelis are the good guys, at least in terms of the context of what they're doing. Now, there is a second question, which is, what about their ideology? Is one ideology worse than the other? Because, ultimately, it's kind of true to say that you could be, you look at Dresden, for example, you could say, well, it was pretty excessive. Or, the bombing of, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you can say, well, that was pretty excessive. But it's almost like, do you even need to talk about how excessive it was as an act of violence? I mean, the thing is that fundamentally you had one ideology that was pretty okay versus an ideology that was very obviously evil, disgusting fascism. As far as I'm concerned, you don't really need to, when you're judging like the morality of the powers in World War II, I don't think you judge it by which side caused the most death, which side caused the most suffering. You judge it by which side was, like the evil fascist ideology, and which side was, broadly speaking, against that. I don't want to say like that the Allies were heroes or anything like that, but certainly I'm glad that the Allies won and the fascists lost. And if you're going to be one of the people who say, Winston Churchill was just as bad. Well, if you're not going to actually like put your money where your mouth is and say, you know what, I wouldn't have minded if Hitler won and Winston Churchill lost, then shut up. Like, sure, Winston Churchill wasn't great, but don't be like, Winston Churchill was just as bad. It's like, are you seriously saying that you would be fine with Hitler having won, Winston Churchill surrendering to Germany, and instead of the reverse, because Winston Churchill was just as bad? No, I don't think you really are saying that. So you don't really think he was just as bad. Or you're just, I don't know what you're on about. Like, that's the thing, I just don't get it. You can say that there was unambiguously a good guy, or, good guys and bad guys in World War II, without having to assume that every single person on the Allied side was fantastic. No, of course they weren't. But like, to say there wasn't an obvious good guy in that war, I don't know what you're on about. So with that said, the question is there an obvious good guy and bad guy in terms of the ideology? Like, even if you ignore, the actual violence, just is one side fighting for the right thing? I don't really know. I mean, certainly, here's the thing. I think that it's definitely true to say that there is a growing kind of like seemingly fascism thing going on in Israel, where there's just like a growing number of Israelis who just hate the Palestinians. They hate them and they just want them gone. Like, it is, I don't know. I mean, we're talking something approaching ethnic cleansing, it can seem like, in extreme cases. And it's, it's a spectrum, definitely. But there is like a lot of people, or there are a lot of people in Israel who definitely, it seems like, they are just so angry that they're like, you know what, we just want them gone by any means necessary. We don't even care about trying to have a, nice multicultural society where everyone gets along or anything like that. We just want them gone. We just want Israel to be purely for the Israelis, Israel first, all that kind of stuff. Now, on the reverse, you do have the Palestinians, where it's exactly the same situation, right? Like, a lot of the time it's, they really hate the Israelis. They really want the Israelis gone. Like, a lot of them would literally, I mean, there is like this quote of like, there's a quote of, if the Palestinians put down their arms tomorrow, there would be no more war. If the Israelis put down their arms tomorrow, there would be no more Israel. which basically is another word saying that the fighting would stop if the Palestinians stopped fighting, but if the Israelis stopped fighting, then the Palestinians would march in and basically destroy Israel. Now, I think that certainly is probably true of some context, but I think nowadays that's probably not as true as a lot of, say, Israel defenders might like it to be. I think it's definitely true at this point. There's lots of Israelis who'd be like, you know what, yeah, let's just march in there and totally destroy Palestine. But, I think that's not to take away from the fact that certainly I imagine that for the Palestinians, a lot of that kind of idea is true, which is to say, in other words, that if the Israelis didn't put up a fight, I think there are lots of Palestinians who would just want to see Israel destroyed. Which is pretty insane, it's pretty aggressive. There's that other quote, like, either they will drive us into the deserts or we will drive them into the sea. So in terms of like ideologies, there is definitely got to a point where just these two sides hate each other. They really do hate each other, like a lot. And yet at the same time, there are people who want to basically just have Israel be, or, Israel-Palestine, let's say, be broadly, like, they'll be friendly and they'll get along and everything will be fine. And there are people like that on both sides. I don't think you can really say, like, that the ideology of the state of Israel is intrinsically worse than the ideology of the Palestinians. Admittedly, when you talk about the ideology of the Palestinians, it gets a bit complicated. I think the fact that the ideology of the Palestinians in some sense has to be said to be Islam, kind of, that counts against them, right? Because, Islam's a horrible, terrible ideology. So, like, at the end of the day, I think it would be an easier choice to make if the Palestinians were, say, for example, Christian, if they weren't Muslims. Because being Muslims, it's like, oh, so you believe that guy who basically said that in the last day every single Jew will be killed, you believe that he was the example to all men? You believe that the guy who said that Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures, you think that he's an example to all men? That doesn't sound very good. Like, ultimately, I guess you run into the issue of, like, should you really take people's professed religions very seriously most of the time? But assuming you should, you would say, well, what's the ideology of the Palestinians? Considering the fact that the vast, vast majority of them are Muslim, you would say, well, their ideology is that Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures, that they should look forward to the day when every single Jew will be slaughtered where they stand. And that's to say nothing, of course, like, beliefs about women and stuff. And of course, apart from anything else, the belief that, every non-Muslim should be fought until they're in complete subjection to Islam. You can't really, like, escape from that, can you? Like, at the end of the day, if you really want to be honest, you'd say, well, that's the Palestinian ideology. The majority of them are Muslim, so what's their ideology? That they should have a theocracy where every single person who opposes their religion is fought until they're in complete subjection. And there's nothing like that in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Nowhere in the Jewish and Christian scriptures does it say every non-Jew needs to be fought until they're in complete subjection. Nowhere in the Christian scriptures does it say every non-Christian needs to be fought until they're in complete subjection. That's what it says in the Muslim scriptures. So I don't know. If you're talking about ideology, you got to run into the fact, like, I do think, basically I would say that if the Palestinians weren't Muslim, then yeah, I would think they would have an edge when it comes to ideology, because I think the Jews and the Israelis, more specifically, have become increasingly crazy and, like, fascistic and like nationalistic in, like, the bad way, while the Palestinians, I think some of them are reasonable, but that's the issue. You have this, like, do I really want there to be another society that basically has Islam as a relevant social force? Not really. I think, we need probably a great deal fewer of those societies. So, it's a toss-up. I'd say broadly, I'm probably more, when it comes to ideology, I'm probably broadly on, like, the Israeli side, because I'm like, well, I think the Israeli ideology, you could say, like, from the pure, like, nationalist standpoint isn't very good, but I think more broadly it's probably more pro, like, freedom and stuff. So it's kind of like, oh, if the really extremist Israelis got their way, yeah, maybe they would kick out every single Palestinian, and that's pretty intense. But you know what? At least once they'd done that, I think their society would broadly be okay, for, like, broad like liberal principles and stuff. Whereas the alternative is like if the extreme Palestinians came into power and kicked out the Israelis, I don't think you'd want to be going to Palestine. You know, I don't think it would be a nice place to go to. And I'll tell you what, you know, the gays for Palestine and all that kind of stuff, I don't think you want to go to Palestine. But yeah, I think I just need to stress the fact that the situation broadly is screwed up. It's a complete mess. It's just not like, that's the thing. I don't really get how people have strong opinions on this, because it's like, how can you? Because it's just like, at this point, it's just a screwed up situation. Like, I don't really get people who are like, oh, the Israelis are terrible, or the Palestinians are terrible. It's like, it's just a horrible situation in general. You know, I don't get like saying that one side's terrible. Because it's like, okay, sure, you could say, well, the Israelis are doing very bad things at this exact moment. But are you seriously saying like they wouldn't be doing those things if it weren't for horrible things that the Palestinians have been doing, or rather that, I can't think how to phrase that so it grammatically makes sense. But the point I'm making is the reason they're doing those things comes back to like horrible things the Palestinians did. But then like, of course, that comes back to horrible things. Like both sides have done horrible things. And then ultimately you come back to like, well, that's why I think it's worth looking at like the early questions. Like, well, were the British even right to establish this? But the point is, you know, I don't think there's any point at which you can actually say like that blame lies very definitively with anybody at all for this whole thing. I do just want to point out another thing which makes this complicated, which is of course the relevance of international powers, because this isn't just a conflict on its own thing. It's a proxy war basically between lots of different sides, but broadly you'd say it's the USA versus, I mean, you know, you could say Iran, but I think ultimately you could sort of say that Russia has a role here. But let's just say, broadly speaking, it's the USA versus various anti-Western powers. Now, obviously, within that context, the USA supports Israel, and the, you know, anti-Western powers, they support Palestine, because of course, you know, they're going to oppose the USA. Which, you know, is all kind of very interesting. But I think it's worth stressing just kind of the arbitrariness of it. Because guess what? You know, when you look at Kosovo, Kosovo is a Muslim country which stands in opposition to Serbia. And it's supported by the USA. The USA supports Kosovo. And Russia supports Serbia. You know, it's completely like, the religion doesn't have anything to do with it. When you talk about from the international relations perspective, it's not as if like, oh, the, you know, like people obsess over kind of the relevance of like being, you know, the evangelicals, but it's like, well, you know, no, actually the USA, I think when you break it down, are supporting the Jewish the Jewish Israelis for the exact same reason that they're supporting the Muslim Kosovans. And obviously the flip side is, you know, the kind of anti-Western powers are supporting the Muslim Palestinians for the exact same reason they're supporting the Christian Serbians. Because it's just an opportunity to advance your own clout on the international stage. It's not about ideology, it's not about religion, you know. It's not that any of these countries actually believe in anything apart from just maximizing their own power. So, you know, ultimately you kind of arrive at a situation where, you know, it's worth stressing the relevance of the fact that you've got, you know, definitely the fact that the USA is basically having a proxy war in everything they do, certainly exacerbates many of the issues there. But it's just worth stressing, it's not like there's some ideological root to all of this. No, they'll just do whatever. And of course, I mean, alternatively, I mean, you have, for example, the Armenians, who are Christians, who face a lot of issues. You know, I think you could make a very strong argument that rightfully the Armenians should have a country that's twice the size it is. You know, they've really been screwed over internationally. And they really don't have very many friends, the Armenians, you know. They've got Russia to the north, who, you know, hates them kind of. You've got Turkey and Azerbaijan either side who hates them. You know, and there aren't really any Western powers that particularly care to help out Armenia. So, you know, you got, the Armenian Christians screwed. And then, of course, you've got the Uyghurs, who are even more screwed. You know, in China, no one's helping them out. So it's kind of like, I just, really want to stress, like, when you talk about it from, like, the international relations perspective, religion is irrelevant. It's not like, oh, the Western powers are supporting all of the Christians and the Muslim powers are supporting all of the Muslims. No, not at all. And of course, you've got the fact that Saudi Arabia, I think they don't really care about Palestine at all because Saudi Arabia is pretty comfortable being allied to the USA and the UK. So they're not going to jeopardize that by really being, if they wanted to, they could really make a firm stand, there we go, and be like, you know what, we're going to oppose Israel, we're going to support Palestine, but they're not doing it because it's all just a game. So yeah, I just wanted to stress that. And to be honest, this is why I have a very kind of firmly non-ideological understanding of international relations. I think a lot of the time people will hear me talk about different ideologies. Let's say, particularly, for example, people might hear me talk about Islam and think that I'm one of those people who would attribute, say that, Islam and the ideology of Islam and, the horrible, immoral things that can be found in the Islamic scriptures are have a lot of explanative power when it comes to geopolitics. And the answer is no. I think they have virtually zero relevance. I think that you could basically completely come up with an accurate understanding of geopolitics and basically, everything from the broader scopes of geopolitics to the very minor specific conflicts without ever really needing to understand the relevance of the commands of Islam to that, or indeed, rather, without understanding the, Islamic commands and, how clear they are in the, violence they command. Because I don't think it's actually relevant. I don't think that religions tend to motivate behavior on the international stage, because I think most people who get to a position where they have that kind of power have basically sold out any ideology they may have once had, because that's just, I don't know, that's how the world works. And I think certainly there are, I think you could say, for example, ISIS was taking Islam very seriously. And I would say in that context, you can't really understand ISIS that well without understanding that, hey, when they, for example, killed Shiites and things like that, they were doing it because Islam commands the death of apostates. And I think from a Sunni point of view, Shiites are apostates. And of course that's why, for example, I don't think you can explain to some extent the full extent of the ISIS killing spree without pointing to the commands of Islam. And basically the fact that, I don't think they would have killed so many people who they thought to be kind of fake Muslims and traitors to the Islamic cause if there wasn't that command to kill apostates in the Islamic scriptures. So, yeah, I think maybe ISIS, you could say, can only be explained by looking at Islam. But even then, I think certainly there's the relevance of how ISIS came to emerge, because you could say, well, why is it that ISIS are the only people who really took Islam seriously, while so many other people haven't? And I think the answer there is because there was an opportunity to do that because of the kind of anarchy created. And then ultimately you get back to, the fact that it was ultimately caused by geopolitics, and kind of principally political factors rather than theological factors. I don't think you ever find yourself in a situation where it's just somebody starts believing a religion and that completely apropos of nothing just changes the international world stage. So yeah, I think that's basically why Kosovo is supported by the US, but then so is Israel, because the US, they're not motivated by some particular hatred of Muslims or something like that. They're just motivated by advancing their own power on the world stage. Now you could say, what's the solution to all of this? And I don't think there is one. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't end the video there. I think it's very difficult to arrive at one. Really, if there's any solution, then it would basically be what I kind of already said, which is the European Union, or, more broadly speaking, regionalism. The idea of making it so nation states are less relevant on the global stage. How is it that we haven't had any major wars in Europe since World War II? It's because of the EU, right? It's because of the fact that that Germany and France don't need to fight each other anymore because they're basically under the same supranational entity. And within that context, you'd say, well, maybe we should start trying to, the EU should try to spread. To be fair, the EU is a bit of a disaster, but something like the EU, a regional, supranational governance that would spread And I think that's it, basically. Regionalism, making the nation state less relevant. Now, of course, one of the issues you would run into is when you kind of think about it, the European world and the Arab world are possibly the two least likely to ever kind of combine together. You know, there's an extent to which there's a degree of insolubility between those two, I believe is a appropriate term to use. And within that context, you could say, well, maybe you just, with, you know, having done that, turn Palestine into a battleground between like regional Europeanism versus regional Pan-Arabism. Ultimately, I do think that, yeah, you can't really this is the issue. You can't really have clearly well-defined nation states and peace. Like, I don't see how those two things can coexist because there's too many legitimate conflicts between nation states. Like, you can't have a Palestinian nation state and an Israeli nation state. And I think the solution there is just to say, well, in that case, we can't have nation states at all. Like, nation states, they don't work universally. And I think the only solution is to basically not really have them be as much of a thing universally. You know, most of the world, I don't think, can really have nation states, because most, nation states, they're constructs. So broadly, I would say, yeah, just regionalism, make nation states less relevant. It's how to solve a lot of problems. So let's sum up. First of all, the conflict is not that complicated. It's, I would argue, kind of easy to explain, or at least as easy to explain as most other wars. Two, the history of how it started, I think, you can't really just say that it was an immoral decision at any point. It was just unfortunate. And as for things currently, I would argue that both sides are pretty terrible in their own ways, and there's no clear good guy or bad guy. And as for a solution, I think the only solution is just to make the entire idea of having a Jewish nation state or a Palestinian nation state increasingly less relevant until you can basically just say, hey guys, it doesn't really matter, can you stop fighting? Which is, I think, basically what happened in Ireland. So there we go, learn from the best. Just going back and editing this, it occurs to me that I never once mentioned the fact that, of course, from my perspective as a Christian, I think that the Jews being expelled from Israel was a divine punishment for their rejection and murder of the Messiah. I mean, when you look back through the Bible, you see that the Jews are constantly kicked out of the Promised Land when they rebel against God. And I actually think that happened within such a short, just a couple of decades of them murdering Jesus probably is pretty strong evidence that he actually was the Messiah. I mean, sorry to tell the Jews that, but it just seems like, maybe when a guy comes and claims to be the Messiah and then you kill him and then suddenly your entire civilization just gets destroyed and you get scattered across the earth and persecuted for ages, maybe God's trying to tell you something. But the thing is, I don't mention that because it's just not very relevant from analysis perspective. I mean, sure, there is the fact that I genuinely do believe that the establishment of Israel is an act of spiritual rebellion against God himself, but there's just not really anywhere I can go with that, which I guess it's just a good example of how, what I mean when I say that I will kind of detach ideological notions from my analysis of international relations, because for me it's very easy to talk about international relations independent of any other beliefs I might have, which I don't think actually inform, analysis of international relations. In this case, like saying that certain actions on the international stage may or may not have some relevance to the divine doesn't really help to arrive at any useful conclusions about international relations theory. So that's why I didn't mention it. I just think it would be kind of funny if I ended up making a nearly hour-long video about this issue without making clear that my sincere opinion on this issue is that I'm unambiguously against the existence of the State of Israel. I believe that the existence of the State of Israel is an act of spiritual rebellion against God, as indeed I believe that the Jews have been actively engaged in consistent spiritual rebellion against God for the last 2,000 years. Having said that, maybe it's slightly more hilarious to make an entire video not having said that and now just drop it right at the end, as if it's just like, hey, by the way, that's the actual truth.